All right. We have our guest here, and I want to get to him because as much as he loves listening and watching our show, he does it every night. We didn't invite him on just to do that. We invited him on to actually participate in the show, so I want to make sure we get to them. He is, as I said, my friend, my former colleague at The Intercept. He has become, I think, one of the very, very best investigative journalists. He now writes at Substack, and he has a new article about Ukraine in the media. He has a recent article that we actually didn't report on about Israeli influence operations inside the United States, and notably how they are not treated anywhere the same as alleged Russian influence operations. And we want to talk to him about many other things, including things regarding the 2024 election. Lee, it is always great to see you. Thanks for coming on. Congratulations on getting to listen to so much of our show, but I'm happy to have you be able to speak as well.
I was enjoying every second of it.
No, I know. You're one of our biggest fans. All right, you have this new article out in Substack that I believe you published just today, just a few hours ago, where you're essentially describing the tactics of media outlets, including the New York Times, to suppress or get people to be indifferent toward the risks of escalation or the risk of nuclear war from doing things like allowing the EU and the UK to launch long-range missiles deep inside Russia. There's the article on the screen. It says the New York Times' previous reporting undermines its war escalation journalism. And there's a subheadline that describes as well. So let me just ask you, what do you think the New York Times and broader corporate media outlets are doing in order to kind of suppress this debate about, or the debate that we should be having regarding Ukraine?
Well, look, many reporters have pointed out this dynamic that oil lobbyists, bank lobbyists, defense industry lobbyists often launder their viewpoints through academic appearing think tanks that instead of going directly to the media, they will work with something that has a euphemistic name, that has a nonprofit title, that seems dedicated to the public interest, and funnel their money and opinions through that to shape the media. I'm not the first one to point this out, but what's incredible here is that the New York Times is agenda setting for this Ukraine-Russia conflict, constantly kind of just reporting on every step of this escalation, whether it's supplying new tanks, new fighter jets, new missiles, with this latest decision to allow long-range surface-to-surface missiles that could strike Russian oil refineries, cities, civilian and military infrastructure, a major escalation of the war. The New York Times is repeatedly going to just one independent expert voice. They'll quote the political and military leadership and then have one expert opinion voice, and it's the CSIS think tank, the Center for Strategic and International Studies in Washington. What's incredible here is that 10 years ago, the New York Times did a series of investigations. I mentioned that I'm not the only reporter to point this out. The other reporters to point this out are the New York Times. They did a whole series on how, out of all the most prominent think tanks in Washington, D.C., among the most prominent think tanks, CSIS is very problematic in the sense that they have been working with defense contractors, Lockheed Martin, General Atomics, Northrop Grumman, and many others, allowing registered lobbyists to appear as scholars at this think tank to promote, higher defense spending, higher export licenses of American defense products, meetings with defense officials, helping shape the entire programming at this think tank. They've really exposed it. The New York Times did a great job 10 years ago. But zoom forward to today, when they're reporting on this major escalation in the conflict, just as they've reported over the last 2 years on this conflict, they're repeatedly going back to CSIS. And in the latest news article today, just about this, decision to use these ATACMS surface-to-surface missiles, they're quoting CSIS as their only expert, and they're quoting an individual, Seth Jones, who doubles as a consultant at a defense industry public affairs firm that reportedly engages in lobbying. So they're doing the exact same thing that they've called out for a decade.
Well, one of the other points that I want to add to that, I know you've done reporting, which we're going to get to in a separate article that you published last month, on how much Israeli money is flowing to influence Americans to advocate for the Israeli government, sort of exactly what these defendants in the case that we just covered were accused of doing for Russia, and yet nobody seems to care, nobody seems to mind. That's all, no one pays attention to that, no one talks about it. It'd probably be anti-Semitic if you tried. But we'll get to that in a minute, but there was also some New York Times reporting that I know you paid a lot of attention to because one of the think tanks it talked about was one where you worked, about how so many of the leading think tanks that influence our foreign policy, like the Brookings Institution, are drowning in all sorts of foreign money, particularly Persian Gulf money, the United Arab Emirates or Qatari money or Saudi money. And you know, I remember there being a big scandal at the Center for American Progress because they would often publish who their funders were, and many of the largest ones were just anonymous, but one of the ones that often funded the Center for American Progress was the Emiratis, the government of the United Arab Emirates in Dubai, and they are obviously notorious for their savage human rights abuses and dictatorial conduct and the like. Why do you think that things like that kind of foreign influence get almost no attention in lieu of focusing almost exclusively on Russia?
Well, you know, these laws, you know, they are neutral in the way they're written. You know, they're supposed to apply to all foreign agents, any kind of foreign country funding propaganda, funding lobbying. They have to abide by the Foreign Agent Registration Act and disclose their activities. But as we've seen, this law is selectively applied on U.S. enemies, and on U.S. allies, it's rarely applied. So, you know, the fact that the Emiratis, which do disclose a lot of lobbying, but at the same time engage in another kind of bundle of lobbying that's completely in the dark, we never see the same type of enforcement. I mean, at best, we've seen a little bit of Gulf country enforcement. There has been some of a crackdown on some Qataris influencing some think tanks. You know, but Emirati money flows across Washington, D.C. It's, you know, the think tank that I used to work at, the Center for American Progress, those on the center left, those on the center right, those certainly on the center, university professors, lawmakers, their staff, even, you know, the arts institutes all across and ballet and theater all across DC, everyone's getting Emirati money. And so, you know, they've bought off the elite class in DC. So not only are they allies of the U.S., but they're truly kind of ingrained into the power structure.
Right. Just to emphasize that point, I mean, these think tanks are not just these like quasi-scholarly groups that just issue papers that nobody reads. They're usually people that go in and out of government. They're often like a kind of shadow government, a part of the State Department or our foreign policy. And the Center for American Progress, as you know, was founded by John Podesta, who was one of Bill Clinton's top aides and then ran Hillary Clinton's campaign, certainly would have been her chief of staff had she won. And then the next president was someone named Neera Tanden, who, aside from being a crazy woman on X, also became and still is working as a top domestic foreign policy advisor to Joe Biden. They were running institutes, making a ton of money that were funded by the Emiratis. All of Washington is drowning in foreign money. Tony Blair became extremely rich by essentially just going around the world and using his name and credibility on behalf of some of the most savage dictators on the planet. And it's remarkable how we fixate on like $1,000 of Russian money as though it's a threat to the pillars of our democracy, when basically the elites of our whole country are feeding at that foreign trill. Just on the topic of this article that you wrote, the New York Times reliance on this kind of handful of experts who all say the same thing, and they have these benign sounding names, just like the pro-censorship groups do, those ones that Pierre Omidyar funds and Bill Gates and George Soros, these kind of like organization for the promotion of a healthy discourse, and like all they're really there to do is like give reports on what is disinformation, therefore what should be censored. The thing that just strikes me so much about this is we played this video last night from George Carlin. He was on the Late Late Show with Tom Snyder. This is back in 2008. And he was talking about media, and he said the reason why people like, say, Noam Chomsky or Howard Zinn, he named two left-wing radical historians, but you could now put into that group some sort of people on the populist right as well. The reason they're not on TV is not because they're not qualified to opine in our discourse. I mean, you're talking about extremely credentialed people. He was saying that the reason why they don't go on TV is because the parameters of debate are agreed to and established by the media in advance. And it's a very, very narrow range of debate, even though you see people on television yelling at each other. And I think this has always been a sort of subtle point, but so important, is that if you go and talk to people at the New York Times or wherever, or any of these corporate media outlets, they will say, and they really believe it, oh, we don't propagandize, we don't try and drive people to what to think, because we're free, we include all opinions. And yet, as you say, one of the techniques, the key techniques that you can use for propaganda is picking and choosing who is worth hearing from and who is not. And if somebody is just vehemently opposed to the NATO war in Ukraine or warning about the escalation, they'll just be deemed inherently unserious for that reason alone.
No, just as we talked about earlier this year, there's a range of U.S. government-funded. It's not just the billionaires like Gates and Amedia. U.S. taxpayer money flows to a range of anti-disinformation think tanks that create reports for social media, for the mainstream media, for other reporters, basically as guidebooks of who you're allowed to speak to and who you're not. And they use claims like hate speech and disinformation and the false allegations, or at least allegations with absolutely no evidence of certain critics of the war of being Russian agents, and they will disqualify dissidents or any kind of critical view. They've done that to you. They've done that to Jeffrey Sachs. They've done that to John Mearsheimer and many other experts to try to limit the scope of the debate. And I'm not one to say that our media in the U.S. is equivalent to that in Russia or China or some other authoritarian structure. I do think we have a much more dynamic and open media with much more free speech and individual rights in this country. But if you look at how the debate is shaped, the kind of contours of the Overton window at the big establishment press that kind of agenda set and set the narrative for the rest of the media that have incredible influence, not just in elite circles, but in the grassroots as well, on topics like the Ukraine-Russia war, for certain foreign policy, major power conflicts, the range of acceptable opinion is incredibly narrow. Go back and read the last 20 kind of news articles at the New York Times about around these debates over, the Congress approving that $40 billion, $50 billion aid package earlier this spring, about the decision to provide new fighter jets and Abrams tanks, and now this, debate around extending the range of these ATACMS missiles. You won't. And you look for the expert opinion, buried 10 paragraphs deep in each article, you won't find any criticism. You won't find the criticism you'll read is from CSIS and similar think tanks like the Atlantic Council that are funded by defense contractors and the U.S. government, basically arguing the only criticism is that it's not enough. We should be going further. We should be striking Russia more directly. We should be providing more arms. It's incredibly propagandistic. And it kind of just it's potentially why we haven't had a more serious debate in Congress and in the kind of public sphere about this very dangerous conflict.
Yeah, I remember back in 2002 and 2003 in the run-up to the Iraq War, everyone knew the incentive scheme in Washington. If you came out as a think tank scholar or some expert in the history of war, and you just simply said, I'm against the invasion of Iraq, I think that weapons of mass destruction are non-existent. I think this intelligence is manipulated. You had some space in media to be heard, but you didn't get into the door of where policy is made. You were automatically excluded because it was deemed that you had nothing of use to say. Everyone understood that if you wanted to get into the policy-making rooms in Washington, if you wanted to be called to testify before Congress, you could quibble with the Iraq war policy. Oh, I think we should wait a couple more months until the UN inspections are done. I think we should ignore the UN. I think we should go in. There was that kind of debate. As long as you affirmed the core fundamental premise that we were going to invade Iraq, that was the price of admission to be deemed serious or competent enough to be heard as an expert. And that's the same exact thing with the war in Ukraine. The minute you say, I think we should get out of the war in Ukraine, I think we should just get a settlement done, by definition, you are considered somebody unqualified to be listened to, and you simply won't be included in the New York Times no matter how credentialed you are. You're automatically excluded. All right, let me ask you, Lee, you said something about this earlier today on social media. It's something that we've talked a lot about, and I genuinely, it's something that shocks me, but I genuinely don't understand it. Because the conflict between Washington and Moscow was genuinely considered existential as part of the Cold War, from the end of World War II up through the collapse of the Soviet Union at the end of the 1980s. Some very extreme things were done in the name of that conflict. And driving all of it was everybody was petrified about the possibility of provoking a nuclear war, because the U.S. had used 2 nuclear weapons to end World War II just in 1945, which for the Cold War was still pretty recent. And people are petrified of it. Kids used to every day get trained to how to go into nuclear bomb shelters. The desire to avoid nuclear war, not even intentional, but by miscalculation, miscommunication, misperception, was absolutely central to everything we did. And as you observed earlier, and I've been observing this for a while too, it's as though that fear, no one has that fear anymore in the West, to the point that every couple months we cross some line that we previously said we would never cross because it's too provocative or too dangerous in terms of escalating with Moscow. And we've even had articles like in the Atlantic and other places saying, no, we can't be blackmailed by nuclear war. It might not even be that big deal. You can probably survive it. What do you think explains this really deranged indifference to or minimizing of the risk of the one thing that actually can be an extinction level event for humanity?
I think fundamentally, just starting this conversation, that this is a dangerous conflict that is tempting the risk of all-out nuclear war. There's lots of different scenarios. It's possible that it might start with a small tactical nuclear weapon that is done as kind of a demonstration of might, that then escalates to a response. We don't know exactly how this would play out, but this is one of the closest we've come since the Cold War, probably the most closest we've come to a serious nuclear conflict. And it's just incredible to me because the New York Times and other corporate mainstream media outlets are not against any type of emotional blackmail around existential risks. They've written hundreds of articles around how dangerous the pandemic was, and in many cases overstating the health risk of COVID-19. And other times they've written in that same kind of batch of existential risk articles, they write about climate change, about famine and flood and sea level rise. I mean, COVID-19 and climate change are serious issues. But if you're going to take the editorial angle that it's if you're the paper of record and you need to be reporting on potential civilization destroying events, but carefully avoid the potential for nuclear war, it just to kind of put your listeners in the right mindset. I mean, if there was something equivalent happening in Mexico, if the Chinese government had overthrown or helped overthrow the Mexican government, and the U.S. had invaded Mexico and then got bogged down in a guerrilla conflict and was perhaps losing some territory or losing that war, and the Chinese started supplying missiles that could then strike major American cities and major American oil refineries, major American civilian centers, how would we respond? We would possibly, use nuclear weapons, I think, in that scenario. And you had to put yourself in the place of the Russians, even if you completely, and I completely oppose the invasion of Ukraine, and I think Putin is an authoritarian leader. But this conflict is complex, and there are many historical events that led to this invasion and where we're at today. We could at least put ourselves in the positions of the Russians, that once American-made, Lockheed Martin-made ATACMS missiles are being launched deep into Russian territory, striking areas that are core to the Russian country. If that happened to us, there would be a democratic demand for nuclear weapons. And with just this conversation of what are we risking here? What are we fighting for? Is this for a few miles of territory in the Donbass? What does peace look like? What could this escalation lead to? I mean, these questions are simply not being asked.
I mean, we had a one-day attack on our soil in our lifetime, the only real attack on our soil, which was on September 11th, and we went to war for the next 20 years over it. We radically reshaped our country's character and our legal framework and our values, and we bombed close to 10 countries in that time. We invaded 2. So that was a one-day attack. So think about what's happening in the minds of the Kremlin if right on the other side of their border, the most sensitive part, the one that was invaded twice in 2 world wars that killed tens of millions of their citizens in the 20th century, namely Ukraine, you have all this Western presence, and now NATO countries are participating in the launching of and encouraging the launching of long-range missiles deep into Russia, meaning Moscow, St. Petersburg, their major metropolitan areas. No country would tolerate that, let alone one with nuclear weapons. And it seems like we're just playing this kind of game with it. Like, hey, let's see what happens if we cross the line and now send tanks. Let's see what will happen if we send fighter jets. And now, what else? There's not really much space left other than direct combat once we say we're going to provide long-range missiles and give you the green light to shoot them, especially since the Russian government pointed out today, the Ukrainians don't have the capability to shoot those long-range missiles with any precision because you have to use satellites to do so, which only NATO can do. So NATO will, by definition, be participating in those attacks through the use of their satellites. And I guess I just want to ask you one more time, because maybe there is no, and maybe we don't know the answer any more than I do. I'm asking not rhetorically because I genuinely don't know. What do you think has caused this? Like, it's insane. It is insane to have thousands of nuclear-tipped intercontinental ballistic missiles aimed at one another's cities, the two greatest nuclear powers on the planet, Russia and the United States, that came very close in the past, at least twice, to actually blowing up the entire world and ending humanity not all that long ago, and just be like, who cares? Let's just see what happens. Let's just keep provoking it. Like, what explains that kind of demented indifference?
I don't have an answer to that. I mean, American hubris and privilege that this is a country that, for the blessing of fate, that we're surrounded by oceans and have no near peer threat in this hemisphere, has never been truly invaded and conquered in the modern sense of the word, and we haven't suffered the way that Russians have, so we can't empathize with this kind of paranoia about the West that they have. But just look at the major disasters and the way that wars have unraveled in history. It's come from a combination of hubris and kind of sleepwalking through really kind of reckless decisions without thinking about how the enemy or the adversary could respond. And that seems to be the case here. I hope not. But just rationally, I'm not a military expert. I wouldn't pretend to be, but just rationally speaking, if missiles, long-range missiles were raining down on major American cities, as you mentioned, 9/11, as a 9/11 equivalents were happening on a regular basis, if this kind of missile, decision is approved, how would the U.S. respond? I think that's the kind of debate we need to be having.
It's so obvious. It's so easy to see. As you said, there'd be a democratic demand, a very intense one, for serious retaliation, if not nuclear weapons. If you don't use your nuclear weapons when your cities are being attacked by long-range missiles from a great power, what are they for if not for that? I mean, if the deterrence value of them fails because no one takes it seriously anymore, which the West is doing, then the only thing left to do is to use them. All right. Let me ask you about this article I alluded to, which was published on your Substack last month. And you wrote that with your co-author, Jack Paulson. Is that correct? And
yes, right.
Here
Jack
it is on the teleprompter. We actually had both of you on to talk about a prior investigation into Israeli influence operations in the United States, but this was a new one on August 17th entitled "Leaked Israeli Documents Reveal Effort to Evade Foreign Agent Lobbying Law," the exact law that was just used to prosecute these lifelong black leftist radicals by accusing them of only opposing NATO imperialism, which they've been doing their whole life because Russia ordered them to and paid them to. What is this? What are these leaked documents, and what did they reveal about Israeli influence ops inside the United States?
Well, the last time that Jack and I came onto your show was for the first part of this investigation. That was back in July, where we revealed that this Israeli influence operation that was launched back in 2017, 2018 to encourage Americans to oppose BDS activism, any kind of peaceful boycotts or sanctions against Israel for its conduct against Palestinians or the occupied territories. And this kind of covert influence operation died down over the years and then was relaunched after October 7th, after the Hamas attacks last year. And they've been working to influence a lot of our debates are on college campuses and in Congress. Now, this latest investigation, published last month in collaboration with The Guardian, takes a look at hacked emails and documents from the Israeli Ministry of Justice. That's their equivalent of the Justice Department. And these emails basically look at the internal discussions around that initial launch of this influence operation back in 2017, 2018, 2019, where the Israeli government realized that they were breaking the Foreign Agent Registration Act, that they were clearly, giving money to Americans to influence public opinion and American public policy, and those are the triggers for the law. In fact, you don't even need to give money. If you're taking just direction from a foreign power, that's a trigger for the law. But they secretly retained a former general counsel from the DNC to advise them on how to avoid triggering FARA registration. They discussed how increased enforcement of FARA post 2016 with the many indictments around Russia and Ukraine and the Trump administration might mean that their own kind of influence operation would trigger a DOJ investigation. They wanted to avoid that. And they go into tactics into how they could continue influencing American public policy and public opinion without registering for FARA. So they talk about setting up kind of dummy third-party proxies and nonprofits to channel the money through to kind of conceal the source. They talk about
like the type that was just used, allegedly by RT to funnel huge amounts of money to the right-wing media outlet Tenet Media and their influencers like Dave Rubin and Tim Pool. Exactly that sort of same scenario.
Almost to a T, exactly the same as what's been alleged there. So it's kind of incredible. And they talk about, hey, when we talk to the American recipients and the people involved with this, we'll do it only in-person meetings, so there will be no written notes. They talk about how, since they're creating a chain of command through these proxies, will the kind of ultimate beneficiaries of this money truly use it as intended? And they say, don't worry, we have all kinds of mechanisms set up to make sure they're carrying out our agenda. I'm paraphrasing here, but we posted all of the documents on our respective Substacks, Jack and I, so you can read them for yourself, these internal Israeli documents. And it's just incredible because, like we said at the beginning of this segment, many countries engage in attempts at influence, attempts at shaping American laws, opinion, regulations, major decisions around foreign policy. But this FARA law seems to be very selectively applied because we've laid out, and in addition, many Israeli media outlets have laid out, they've done exposés on how this money from the Israeli government was channeled to groups that went on to help lobby for anti-BDS laws that appeared in Israel to actually say on video, thank you for the money. These are Americans, including American legislators, and then went back and lobbied more to enact laws that were beneficial to Israel. So this is kind of definitionally the type of activity that FARA was designed to regulate, to at least, and it doesn't even prevent this type of activity. It just simply says you have to disclose. You have to disclose where the money's coming from, what kind of activities you've engaged in the last 6 months. It's a disclosure law. And at the Israeli memo state that even that is kind of dangerous because that degrades the effectiveness of the recipients of the money. Any kind of individual that is disclosed as a foreign agent is less effective as a lobbyist.
Obviously, that's the whole point of the disclosure, is to not let people deceive the public into believing that they're advocating on their own instead of on behalf of the government. I, personally would tell the Israelis, like who wrote these memos, just relax. The idea that any American citizen is going to be prosecuted and indicted by either party for serving as an undisclosed agent of the Israeli government is virtually nil. The only time that it ever happened was when this Jewish American agent of the security state, the U.S. security state, Jonathan Pollard, was acting as a spy for Israel and passing the most sensitive top secret documents to the Israeli government. That was a bridge too far, even for the U.S. government. He was indicted and prosecuted, and I think spent something like 25 years in prison. But it was a source of intense animosity between the Israelis and the Americans. The idea that you would imprison a spy for your good friends Israel was outrageous. And I also remember, during the Snowden reporting, one of the documents that we published and reported on was a document that said that Israel is by far the recipient of the most amount of surveillance tech. We give them the most amount of surveillance technology, the most amount of raw data that we collect. And yet at the same time, in a separate list of the top cyber threats to the United States, Israel was number 1 or number 2 on that list, meaning Israel gets all our cyber tech, uses our surveillance technology, gets our raw data, and then becomes the leading threat to spy on the United States, to gather information, sweep up information from the United States government and from Americans, to the point where the NSA regards them as among the greatest cyber threats to the United States, our great friends Israel.
Well, I would only point to, in terms of the U.S.-Israel kind of alliance here and the intelligence sharing that you mentioned, look at how Israeli spying technology was allegedly used for the murder of the Washington Post journalist Jamal Khashoggi, or just the news story that was just like a one-day news story, but it would have been a year-long controversy if it was almost any other country. The fact that there were stingrays, those kind of mobile cell phone spying devices that were found around the White House and allegedly placed there by Israeli agents. It's just
You're
a
saying that if
story.
Russia had done that, there would have been a little bit more sustained attention? Possibly.
Who knows?
You can never know for sure. It's a counterfactual. All right, let me ask you this last question, Lee, before I let you go. I know a lot of people think that you're very young. You like to perpetuate this mythology too, but you're actually not. And I know that you remember how Americans talked about specifically Dick Cheney during the Bush administration. I know you're about to say, oh, I was only 14 or whatever, but I know you lived through that. You remember it very well. It became part of your political framework. And for those who don't remember it, I mean, not only was he repeatedly accused of being a war criminal, but the consensus among liberals and Democrats was that he essentially engineered a coup by ascending to power in the 2000 election because the Republican majority on the Supreme Court stole the election from the rightful winner, which was Al Gore and Joe Lieberman, and instead appointed George Bush and Dick Cheney. As you know, earlier this week, in fact, over the weekend, Dick Cheney and Liz Cheney both endorsed Kamala Harris. And Dick Cheney's pretty old. He kind of stays out of the spotlight. He issued a statement. But Liz Cheney was all over the media, as you would expect her to be. And when she was asked, is the reason you and your father are supporting Kamala Harris simply because you're concerned about American democracy? I love the idea that Dick Cheney, who stole the 2000 election in the eyes of liberals, is so concerned about American democracy and the transfer of power and the integrity of elections. But she was asked, is that the reason, or are there other reasons? And she said, no, there's a lot of other reasons, including the fact that even on foreign policy, how my father and I see foreign policy, we regard the Democratic Party and Kamala Harris as far closer to our ideology and view than we do a Trump-led GOP and the isolationism and pro-Russia stance that he intends to usher in. What do you make of the fact? First of all, do you think Liz Cheney is right that the Democrats and Joe Biden or Kamala Harris are closer to the foreign policy ideology of the Cheneys, which has never changed, they've never said it's changed, than the Trump GOP Republican Party would be? And what do you think about the fact that Democrats are just openly embracing the Cheneys? I mean, that was the one person Kamala Harris really touted, was the fact that Dick Cheney was endorsing her.
Well, look, the Republican Party is not monolithic. There are big factions of it. The establishment of it is still very new conservative, but they are scared to death about people like J.D. Vance and, depending on the time of day, Donald Trump. Donald Trump's a little bit all over the map, but there are populist elements of the GOP that seem ascendant, that wholeheartedly reject the neocon point of view, that are anti-interventionist, that are skeptical of the foreign intervention and foreign war and these kind of entangled foreign alliances. The Democratic Party, just in terms of this zero-sum game that we have, a winner-take-all democratic system, where since they see kind of this instability on the right for their viewpoints, they are drifting to the left, to the at least to the center left, and there is a lot of continuity. There are a number of people who are serving in the Biden administration who have recently served, like Victoria Nuland, who are very well connected with this kind of network of DC neocons. in terms of this endorsement, I mean, it doesn't make sense to me. I mean, it kind of makes sense in this in the sense that, Kamala wants to move to the center and have bipartisan credential, but Hillary Clinton's big fault in 2016 was embracing the establishment with a bear hug and not really realizing the populist anger at the powers that be, whether that's in Wall Street or the establishment political system. Kamala has not done that to the same degree, but she risked, I think, a lot of her election or candidacy viability by repeating the same mistake.
Yeah, I don't know if you know or if you've heard, but she grew up in a middle-class home with a middle-class mom. Lee, thank you so much. It's always great to have you. The two articles that you published, the one about Israel and its influence operations campaign and these leaked documents, the one about how the New York Times relies on particular sources to shape this narrative, is exactly the kind of sort of really like classic shoe leather investigative journalism that you do, and people can find that, and I hope they will subscribe to your Substack, where that kind of reporting is very frequent, and it's always great to see you. Great to have you on my show. Thanks very much for coming on.
Thanks for having me, Glenn.
All right, have a great evening. Thanks for watching this clip from System Update, our live show that airs every Monday through Friday at 7 p.m. Eastern, exclusively on Rumble. You can catch the full nightly shows live or view the backlog of episodes for free on our Rumble page. You can also find full episodes the morning after they air across all major podcasting platforms, including Spotify and Apple. All the information you need is linked below. We hope to see you there.